Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of the Sherlockian interview. It's one of my favourite types of interview because it's a launch day interview, which means that the interview is taking place on the launch day of the book. And with us, we have Janet Shaw, who is from Australia, but she's going to tell us a little bit about where from in just a second. And her book, New Cases of Sherlock Holmes, is out today. So, hi, Janet.
Hello.
Where about in Australia can we find you?
Oh, yes, I'm in Melbourne. I live in Melbourne. I spend most of my time in Melbourne. Also, some of my time in the country with my husband outside town as well.
Fantastic. And we see you in a very brightly painted room there, nice red room, and a wonderful bookshelf behind you. Would we be able to find some Sherlock stuff on the bookshelf?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Along the bottom shelf there, next to the Lee Childs, actually. all the Sherlocks are there. And in fact, I'm going to show you later on the family Sherlock as well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, you mentioned Lee Child. You're in good company in terms of interviews. We interviewed Lee a couple of months ago for the Sherlockian interview. So we've got him in our app. And along with many authors. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have a bit of a question and answer session, but after a reading. So for those of you that have joined online, if you can put your questions into the Q&A window, then we'll try and get through as many of them as we can. And we're going to hand over now to Janet. If you can take us through reading from New Cases, and then we'll jump to the Q&A.
Thank you. I'm going to read an extract from a story called The Case of the Mysterious Teeth. And we're going to pick it up a couple of pages in. Holmes and Watson have been summoned to Scotland Yard by Lestrade. So we'll pick it up here. And of course, it's Dr. Watson speaking, narrating. We reached the broad, imposing steps of Scotland Yard, and I paused for breath before mounting them, two at a time, still trailing Holmes and the constable. Once inside and shouldering through the busy vestibule past citizens of all walks and in all humours, we were led down a deep flight of stairs to the gloomy cellars that housed the morgue. Lestrade greeted us. "You got my message all right then?" He nodded to the constable. "Very good, Johns. Off you go." He turned to us with animation as the young policeman took the stairs. "I thought to myself, you would very much like to see this one, Mr. Holmes. I think you will agree this is quite in your line. In here." We followed him through a pair of heavy doors into a large, low-ceilinged room lit by at least a dozen new electric lights. Their illumination was so intense I was momentarily blinded, but by the time I'd followed Lestrade and Holmes to the far corner of the room, I could see that we were approaching a table upon which a sheet had been laid. I could see that under the sheet lay a body. Lestrade stepped to the head of the table and drew back the sheet theatrically. Revealed lay a young woman, pale in death, her eyes closed and her cheeks alabaster, altogether giving one the impression of a marble goddess, an impression only heightened by her bare shoulders, the delicate underclothes she was wearing, and the luxuriant hair that tumbled over her shoulders. She was possessed of almost regal beauty. "What dreadful misfortune has overtaken this poor young lady?" I asked. "I rather fancy that the answer to your question is the reason we have been summoned," said Holmes, looking to Lestrade. "Well, my friend, what are we to observe? You rather have the advantage of us." "And not the first time, I suppose," said Lestrade, but Holmes bore his needling impassively. "Well now, look here." Lestrade gently drew down the front of the woman's camisole to reveal two red spots just above the top of her corset. They were each the size of a pea and were circled in an angry red. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "What dreadful thing has happened here? What's caused these marks?" "Ah," said Lestrade, pointing his finger into the air with an expression of quiet triumph. "I am before you on this, Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes. Clearly this is the bite of some deadly animal. Thus, I took the liberty of calling the head keeper from the London Zoo to help us identify the beast responsible. From thence, we will be able to ascertain how it came about that she was bitten. I expect the keeper imminently." Holmes leaned closer to the dead woman, his keen eye following the line of her camisole, observing her throat and arms, then gently touching her closed fingers. "Gripping," he said, possibly startled. "No ring, apparently unmarried." He stooped over her face and head for a moment, a slightly quizzical expression on his face. "No rigour as yet, a very recent death." "That is certainly so," said Lestrade, with a touch of professional pride. "She was found at the service entrance of St. Bart's Hospital not an hour since and brought here immediately." He looked down at the lovely face with an air that suggested the proprietorial. "Almost warm, this one, though bless me, we don't know who she is." Holmes continued his examination. "No violence to be seen here. Does your pathologist believe there was an outrage?" Lestrade was astonished. "But this death was not by human hand, Mr. Holmes. You can yourself see the bite. This was not murder, so no, there was no outrage perpetrated upon this woman. As it happens, our doctor has not yet attended, but he will confirm what I say. I am in no doubt." Holmes cast me an inscrutable glance. "As you say," he said quietly. "My mistake." At that moment, the young constable came through the doors, followed by a tall and vigorous man dressed in indeterminate garb, neither that of a gentleman nor of a labourer. It took him at once for the zookeeper. "I came immediately, sir," he said, glancing from Holmes to Lestrade. "I'm Robert Morton from the London Zoo." Introductions were made, and Morton was brought forward to examine the bite on the woman's breast. "Well," said Lestrade, "what say you? Viper? Wild cat?" Morton had given an initial start on observing the dead woman. I felt some pity for him. Familiar as he must be with death in nature, I hazarded that he was not so accustomed to viewing the corpse of a young woman. Even I still found that death had a way of seeming always at odds with the living, always ill-placed. Morton gathered himself and, leaning in to examine the bite, was clearly perplexed. "I would say neither, but I'm not sure I can say what creature was responsible for this cruel bite. Unless," he stood upright, "I shouldn't like to suggest this, sir, if I could just see another solution, but I believe the only creature that could make a bite this big without savaging the skin is a vampire bat." His words struck a chill through me, and I read alarm in Lestrade's face. He mouthed the word vampire apprehensively, for in recent months the London police had borne the heavy brunt of the near hysteria that had followed the publication of a lurid new tale of horror concerning just such a beast, but with human form and supernatural powers. Holmes, however, retained his suave calm. "You think so?" he asked Morton mildly. "Your professional judgment is that this young woman was killed by a bat?" "Well, that is, the bite—" "Oh, strike me," said Lestrade suddenly. "Here I am forgetting the best part. Now, vampire bat or no vampire bat, what do you think of this?" With a flourish, he stepped towards the woman and, reaching for her fist, prized open her still soft fingers to reveal in her palm a single arch of vulcanite and porcelain false teeth. "There!" Holmes pounced upon the teeth and held them up to his eye. "Now we begin to see," he said to himself as he rotated the dentures for closer scrutiny. "Well, at least we know it has no bearing on the case at any rate," said Lestrade. He moved to the woman's face and gently opened her lips, revealing her teeth. "Not hers, you see. It was just a novelty I thought would amuse you, Mr. Holmes." He turned to the still flustered Morton. "I thank you, sir, for clearing up this little mystery. Be so good, however, as to tell us where these bats might be found. Perhaps we can issue a general warning to the public. Carefully worded, of course, under the circumstances. Carefully worded." "Not in London, sir," said Morton. "We have none at the zoo, and the Desmodontinae are native to the Americas. I do not believe there are any private local collections. In short, sir, I cannot explain this young woman's bite." Lestrade's smile dropped. I fancied I could see the rush of thoughts tumbling through his head. A vampire was loose in London. It would take the merest spark to ignite a public frenzy about a real Dracula. An inflamed populace, riots, disturbances, perhaps recalling those of the terrible Fenian bombings. The establishment of the London detective force was recent, and the need for it was still being debated in some powerful quarters. Lestrade's authority was, with this one death, of a sudden in jeopardy. Now, Lestrade," said Holmes soothingly. I could see he had also been observing our friend's expressions. "I fancy your imagination is running away with you. Let us confine ourselves to the facts as we have them, and I believe we may release our friend Mr. Morton to return to his menagerie." Morton was only too happy to leave us as Lestrade waved him away. Holmes turned to the detective. "With your permission, I would like to take this keepsake." He held the teeth aloft with an airy wave. "As they have no bearing on the case, I rather think they would make a splendid addition to my own personal Black Museum." He was referring to Scotland Yard's private crime gallery, about which I knew he harboured an intense fascination but had never been permitted to view. "Take the wretched thing," said Lestrade. "But tell me, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of this vampire theory?" "If those marks are the bite of a vampire bat," said Holmes, pocketing the teeth, "then London does indeed face an unprecedented peril. Good day, Lestrade. We can see ourselves out." I hurried to keep pace with the striding Holmes. Mercifully, the pavements were quieter now and the elbows and shoulders more contained to their persons. "Did you mean that, Holmes?" I asked him. "Are we indeed facing a dreadful danger?" "No," said Holmes simply. "We're not facing any danger." "But you said—" "I said, if those were the marks of a vampire's teeth. However, those were not the marks of a vampire's teeth. Therefore, the peril, being conditional, no longer menaces us. Watson, you are a medical man. Did you closely examine those marks, this bite?" "Well, no, I did not, but Lestrade had done so and declared it a bite, and then Morton believed—" "Indeed. Our zoological friend accepted the idea that it was the bite of some animal without applying his own mind to the matter, and he suggested the only beast he could think of with teeth that would fit the wounds. He was not deducing in a rational sequence, Watson. He was, if I may so express it, working backwards. Reflect. Did you observe him studying the bites themselves and analysing them? No? No, indeed. He was carried away with Lestrade's fancy, as perhaps you have been yourself. There is no quicker way of surrendering your powers of deductive reasoning, Watson, than to accept that what you observe is what someone tells you that you observe. Questioning, Watson, questioning. It is at the core of all scientific understanding." I was crestfallen. How many times had Holmes drawn me in and then dismissed me in this way, I wondered to myself. I would almost have taken heart if I could but think I would know better another time, but I knew this hope to be false. I would never know better. Holmes would always trounce me. "So, we are safe?" I asked him tentatively. "There is no vampire roaming London, at least, though whether we are ever really safe, I would not hazard to say." "And the marks?" "I fear, Watson, that the extreme oddness and yet banality of what caused those marks is what led you astray. Tell me, what is the most common small household injury?" "Why, burns, of course, stoves, fires, gas lights, and still in many homes, candles." "Indeed. And the lady we observed just now, was she of a slight build?" "By no means. She was a handsome and well-made woman who would have been stately in life, I feel sure." Now I come to a more delicate question. If one were to drop a small ember, perhaps while holding it up in a pair of tongs to light a taper or a gas jet, and it fell into the top of a well-made woman's corset, how would the burn appear? I ran through my mind the conditions he had stated, and a moment later exclaimed with wonder, "The ember would lodge in her corset. The burn would appear as two symmetrical spots in the centre of the woman's breast. Good heavens, Holmes, this is extraordinary. It was not a bite at all." "No, it was not a bite, and judging from its deep colour, I believe it to have occurred some days since, which perhaps will be confirmed by the pathologist. However, I bethought myself to leave Lestrade a little longer in his somewhat confused garden of thoughts." Holmes reached into his pocket and drew out the false teeth. "This is where my interest lies. I believe these teeth hold the clue to the mysterious death and perhaps the identity of that young woman." He strode forward and I hurried in his wake. You are there, Steve?
I am. I'm just trying to turn my video on. That was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed that. We're getting the audience saying, "Don't stop." They want to know. They want to know what happens in the story. Well, you do have to pick up the book, New Cases of Sherlock Holmes, to find out what happened in that story. And there are many more in the book as well. We're going to jump into the question and answer session. And while we start with some of the questions, those of you that are online, if you can put more questions into the Q&A window, or you can pop them into the chat as well. So I guess the first question is an easy one. When did you first encounter Sherlock Holmes?
Oh, for me, it was as a child. I think I would think for most people that would be the case, but I realize for younger people, sometimes it's not the Conan Doyle stories. It's a more recent interpretation. But for me, it was the Conan Doyle stories. My father was a great enthusiast. He was actually a bit mad, but he would burst into a room and say, "Come, Watson, the game is afoot," and things like that. And we'd all be just kids looking at him, in a bemused way. We'd say, "It was the footprint of a gigantic hound." So my father was an enthusiast. My mother had a very soft spot for Basil Rathbone. So we would sometimes watch those old wartime black and white movies as well. So I continue to read them right through, the Conan Doyle stories. And this is actually my father's book. It's a facsimile from the Strand. So it's got the lovely Sydney Paget illustrations, which are so evocative. But as you can see, it's completely fallen apart, well beyond reading. So I've got proper copies for reading. So it's been lifelong. I've continued to read them, and in more recent years as well, it's been pastiches as they've, as they've crossed my path.
What do you most enjoy about writing Holmes?
It really is tremendous fun. It's really, I think that one of the reasons it's so enjoyable is that Conan Doyle's, we've got his vision. So we've already got the framework there. We've got the characters and the settings and so on. And particularly we've got the language and the kind of story it is. So that as a writer of pastiches, you can just kind of walk into that. It's like a playground. He's built the playground for us, and we can kind of walk into the playground and play with the equipment and not have to worry about what you need to get and to build and so on. So it's great fun in that way. And of course, I'm not a historian. So for me to get some of those facts right, it means I've got to do research in really kind of peculiar and quirky lines of thought. So like, what were false teeth made of in the 1890s? And actually, some of that you don't want to know. It's sort of horrifying. And, other questions like, what was the far right doing at the time? And what would it be like to, what was the UK, how was the UK responding to the terrible the pogroms that were happening in the Russian Empire? And so sort of the research can be anything from light and frivolous to sort of quite serious, but it's got a lot to do, for me, it's got a lot to do with the language. So it's just great fun to kind of play with that. And speaking of play, actually, I mean, when you think these stories were written 130, 140 years ago, a very long time ago, and were very much of their time, it's one of the fun things about writing them, I think, is that you can play a bit, nudge things a little bit. Like we know, Holmes has such a reputation as a misogynist, for example. So in my stories, there are women doing things a lot. There are suffragettes, and there's there's movements and feminists and so on doing things. And in one of the stories, I thought it would be fun to nudge a bit further. So I have Holmes having a terrible argument with Mrs. Hudson and Dr. Watson about his attitude to women, and he's quite explicitly contemptuous about women, and he's sort of saying I could never have a really good case brought to me by a woman. So he makes a deal with Watson about whether or not the next case that comes to him from a client is brought by a woman or not. And the next client who walks in his door is Emily Pankhurst, but I won't tell you what happens next. So I think it's been really playful and enjoyable.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, actually, because there's a question in the chat from Anna, which touches on a subject that comes up in most of our interviews, which is I'll read it in full because it's a great question. I'd be interested to know Janet's thoughts on the trend at the moment to make old classic formats like Sherlock Holmes more PC by making characters more diverse. Does she think this is necessary? Does it detract from the style and purpose of the stories like this? I guess I'll comment initially on that. We have a lot of writers. We have over 200 writers now writing pastiches, and the Sherlock Holmes stories, original ones, were set in an era where certain types of character and certain types of lead character, as you've said there, particularly lead women, don't appear too much in the Sherlock Holmes stories, but other characters like LGBTQ, BAME characters, disabled characters. So we published Wiggins, Son of Sherlock, earlier last year, which is the first major pastiche to have a disabled character as the main character within a Sherlock Holmes pastiche. And I think it's it's important that writers get to express and introduce those types of characters into this format. Most of the writers say that it can't come at the expense of the story. The story has to be the key thing, and Conan Doyle was brilliant at creating wonderful storylines. So where do you sit on that in terms of, do you find that quite difficult to do, or do you do?
Look, in my opinion, there's absolutely room for all of that. And I think one of the things that seems to keep the whole sort of the icon of Sherlock Holmes alive is the fact that there are constantly revisioning of what it is like. And even sometimes those ideas are in conflict. And I think that's actually really healthy for this. My personal taste leads me towards a more traditional pastiche with just a little bit of a more what a modern reader might be looking for. The last thing you'd want, I do get quite distressed when I think about some of our brilliant writers of English literature who get what we now call cancelled. I think that's like it's a mistake to only read a writer in a modern context. They have to be taken, in their own time. There's room for all of these. That you have to read them as products of their time and enjoy them in that way. There's room for all of it.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the importance of historical accuracy. I guess that those facts are super important because the Sherlock Holmes fandom, and I tend to talk about Sherlock Holmes fans as three levels. So you have Sherlockians, who are the entry level, people who like Sherlock Holmes, because you wouldn't call him Sherlock anyway. If you were being really traditional, you'd be calling him Holmes. So even identifying as Sherlockian, you're setting yourself out as, I'm a basic level of interest in terms of Sherlock Holmes. Holmesians are the next level up. So these are the more serious Sherlock Holmes fans that are the next level, and then at the top and the pinnacle are the Doyleans. So there are my three levels, and we have a lot of Doylean fans, and they will pick up on the fact that if in a pastiche a writer says, Holmes and Watson are in a particular part of London, and 20 minutes later they're in another part of London, the Doylean will pick up that at the time the speed of a horse and a cab at that time in 1888 was 4.5 miles an hour, and it would have taken 32 minutes to do that journey, not 20. So that kind of level of historical accuracy, I think, will get picked up on. Was that a big thing for you with these stories?
I think it's a really interesting question. In fact, I read something interesting the other day. I think it was Jerry Shear talking about, on the one hand, on the one end of the scale, you've got people for whom those details, the Doylean type details, are really important. Everything, like what was the weather 130 years ago on a particular day, at one end of the scale. The other end of the scale, you've got people who think, well, this is fiction. It doesn't matter about that because I'm creating a story. For me, I'm definitely somewhere in the middle there, because for me, the idea of historical accuracy is that it's a tool in your toolkit as a writer, and it has to serve the story. So for me, I do have to do research around those obscure things to make it. What you want is that your story is, it's that your reader can trust you enough to leap in, to suspend their disbelief and to leap into your world you're creating. And to get that trust, it has to really feel authentic. For me, I think the biggest thing is language, but not necessarily. I feel as a fiction writer, I'm wondering where obviously sit fairly down low on your pyramid there, but I think a fiction writer actually has license to make, change the map, and even quite literally, put a lane if there's not a lane, as long as the rest of the road system seems to be about right. It's getting an I must say, though, I do have to do a fair bit of research about that, as I mentioned before, which is quite enjoyable. But yeah, so I'm somewhere in the middle. I think, I'm a pedant myself. I love pedantry, so this is not a problem with pedantry. But I think for that end of the scale's too far for me, and I'm certainly not a historian. I'm not a Doylesian, or probably not even a Holmesian.
Well, I think it's important with pastiche to be clear where you are and what you're trying to do. So we have a wonderful series called the Sun and Shadow series from Tracy Revel. So Tracy is an American writer, and she teaches Sherlock Holmes to her class, and she's written a trilogy that starts with a book called Shadowfall, and Holmes is a warlock. So but it's very clear. Holmes is a warlock, and this is a fantasy, and it's quite dark. And people who've read it that were traditionalists said, I really didn't want to like this because it identifies what it is at the beginning. I think the fans get a bit more annoyed where you've got somebody saying, look, I'm writing a traditional pastiche, and then I use the word fall instead of autumn, or that kind of thing. And I guess you have a slight advantage to the majority of Sherlock Holmes writers, who most of them are American, in that the language with Australia is closer to the language than the US language and adaptation language to the UK. We've got a bunch more questions coming in, but I wanted to touch on that we talked about. We've talked a lot about pastiches, but do you have a particular adaptation, maybe on the TV or on movies, that is your favorite adaptation?
Yeah, there have been some brilliant ones, and actually I'm old enough to remember Jeremy Brett, and those series, they were utterly brilliant. They were so I thought faithful to the Conan Doyle vision, and almost like obsessively so, but they're absolutely brilliant. I thought I remember that was in the 80s. That's a long time ago now. I remember when they were on, like they were on at 8 p.m. on Wednesday nights or something here in Melbourne. At the time, I was a young teacher, and I was teaching adults in the city that evening. So I used to have to sort of charge out of the classroom and no time for questions, and jump into a tram and get home, burst in the door, because it was the kind of TV you just didn't want to miss a minute of it. It was brilliant at the time. Having said that, I'm not quite sure how that would look now. It's quite a long time ago. But Jeremy Brett was fantastic. In fact, I mentioned Basil Rathbone before. I'm also old enough to remember Basil Rathbone. Then, like 10 years ago, whenever it was, the absolutely wonderful Sherlock series that Benedict Cumberbatch one. Thought they were fantastic. I mean, that was reimagined in a contemporary setting, but so wild and fast and clever, and I thought they were, fantastic, really enjoyable. And then in terms of books and stories, I feel I've only begun to scratch the surface in terms of what's around. I do have a preference for a more traditional pastiche. So, Jerry Shear or Gretchen Alphabet. Having said that, I love the Laurie King series of books. And they're, that's a bit of a reimagining, but I remember years ago now, a really good friend of mine gave me the Beekeeper's Apprentice, and she said, I think you'll really like this. And I thought, will I though? But, it was fantastic. And then I've just devoured that series more than once as well. And I've only recently found out there are podcasts as well. Like, there's just so much there. So I think with a preference for something more faithful to the Conan Doyle vision, I think there's, so much to enjoy out there in terms of adaptations.
Yeah, I bore people with my fixation on House, which is I often say that's my favorite adaptation of Holmes. Jeremy Brett is and Cumberbatch. You mentioned probably the two, if you like, the two kings of the adaptations that we see in any poll of the fans. Maureen Whitaker did Jeremy's biography, huge book, nearly 500 pages, over 400 photographs. I'll send you a copy. And that won the Sherlock Holmes Book of the Year award for non-fiction. And we were compelled to create a second book, which was just the pages about him as a Sherlock Holmes, because his career was huge. And the section, though, with Sherlock Holmes was 200 pages long, so it was just about big enough to create an extract. So that book, Jeremy Brett is Sherlock Holmes, is one of our best-selling books, and we had to produce it in colour because a lot of the photographs, of course, from Granada were in colour. So Jeremy's definitely up there. We've done 3 biographies of Benedict as well, performance biographies, and that shows you how a prolific career he's had, because to have to do 3 performance biographies and he's still going, and that, the last one I think was about 5 years ago. Apart from Holmes in the canon, have you got any particular favorite characters?
If I don't count Watson and Mrs. Hudson, I do. Well, I like it when there is a character in a story who's a feisty young woman, but that might be because there are really so few of them. But things like, comes to mind The Solitary Cyclist, where the girl just turns around and, says, "That's it, I've had enough, I'm going to confront you," sort of thing. But thinking about favourite characters, I think villains are a lot easier to enjoy. I'm not so much thinking about Moriarty, because sometimes that's painted a little bit sort of, almost, it's a bit extreme sort of thing. But I'm thinking about creeps. Like, creeps are really great villains, and there's not much more creepy than a man disguising himself and deliberately making his own stepdaughter fall in love with him so that she doesn't leave the family home. So that's Hosmer Angel with his, lisping voice and shaded. So he was very creepy. I thought that was a good creep.
Fantastic. So a quick comment from Andy. She's also reading Beekeeper's Apprentice at the moment, and also didn't think she'd like it. Right. But interesting that is enjoying it, and interesting that you did as well. Were there any other, apart from the Holmes stories and other pastiches, were there any other inspirations for you for your writing that are non-Holmes?
Well, my taste is always, most of what I like to read and reread is a lot of it's kind of Victorian literature, a lot of the classic English literature, and certainly earlier things as well. So I guess that's, it's always about the language, I guess. So I sort of read and reread things. I'm a massive Dickens fan. And I think actually that makes me think too, that the humour in Dickens and the humour in Conan Doyle, there's that very dry, only occasional little whispers of it. And I love that. I think that's fantastic. But yeah, I think, the classics, I guess, that I've been reading all my life, I guess.
I think we will have this as a final question as a really, really good wrap-up question, and it's from Scott, which is, were the big lockdowns under COVID that Melbourne encountered, did that aid the writing, or did that make it tougher to do?
That is a good question. I think in my case, because I work full-time and I was working right through, so it's not that I had any more time, but it was really during most of those lockdowns that I was writing these. I think it did concentrate your time more in different ways, perhaps. So, and we were getting told a lot that Melbourne was the most locked down city in the world. We were getting told that up to last year, but that's probably not true anymore. I think we're seeing what's happening in Shanghai at the moment. Yes, I guess it aided. It certainly didn't inhibit it.
Yeah, one of the books that we published under lockdown, and I'll post under the video a link to it, because the title has just gone from my head, which is by a writer called Vince Staden, and it's basic. Oh yes, it's called Hounded. He watched and consumed and read every single adaptation of Hound of the Baskervilles that he could lay his hands on under lockdown, and it's a semi-autobiographical book about his obsession with Holmes, and his obsession with Hound of the Baskervilles, and how under COVID he consumed so much, and so many different adaptations, and got obsessed with the movie posters and all those sorts of things. It's a really fascinating book. It's very much a Marmite or Vegemite book. We're getting 1-star and 5-star reviews. People absolutely love it, and his style of humor around the obsession, and the obsession got pretty bad, because his family were like, come on, Vince, you that's another, it's another evening gone with another weird German adaptation of The Hound in German, you can't even understand it.
And you don't speak German.
And you don't speak German. So under COVID, there's been a lot of interesting books that have come out, but it's interesting to say that you were working full time as well. So, and I guess working hours extended under COVID for most people.
Certainly it bled into your personal life a lot. Yeah, time stretched out.
Did you? And when you? Yeah. Final question for me. Do you have a space where you write? Is there somewhere where you escape in your? You're in the red room. Is red room your?
This is my study. This is my study. But when I'm writing these stories, it is a little bit portable. And initially, I was just making little scribbly notes on a bit of paper. But now I use a laptop. So mostly in here, but it's portable.
Fantastic. Well, it's been an absolutely fascinating interview. Wonderful reading. Lovely chat, comments from people saying they were on the edge of their seat and that they desperately want to know what happened in the story. So New Cases of Sherlock Holmes is out today. From all the usual suspects, you should be able to pick up a copy. You can always get it from the MX Publishing website. A share of all of the sales from our website go to our good causes like Happy Life Children's Home in Kenya and the Undershore School for Children with Learning Disabilities in Hazelmere in the UK. So thank you very much, Janet, and hope to see more stories soon.
There will be. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks, guys.